So we're fortunate to have Richie as our afternoon speaker, bringing us to the end of today's part of the symposium. Professor Richard Davidson is the William James and Willis Research Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry, and he's the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And he's going to be presenting on science, practice, and action, reminiscences of Francisco and reflections on embodied engagement. Richie.
Thank you so much, Al and Roshi and all of the others. As I was saying to Roshi just before, I really miss being at UPIA. And this is the category of meeting where context, I think, makes a difference. It is true that we can reach a much larger audience, which is wonderful and fantastic. And it also is the case that UPIA is a special place and provides a very important kind of container for these amazing discussions and the opportunity that has been created by these meetings. So let me just give a little background to this talk that I'm about to give. I was asked to give a talk several weeks ago at Mind and Life for Mind and Life Europe by Gabor and Amy in a series on Francisco and friends. And it provided an opportunity for me to think about personal experiences with Francisco and also the ways in which his work has been influential both to myself as well as to the fields in which I work more broadly. And I really had a deep connection to that talk and to the process of preparing for it. And then several people sent me notes afterwards, including Roshi, who saw a video of the talk that perhaps I consider talking about some similar themes for the Varela Symposium here. And so in the spirit of mutual circulation and embodied inaction, I have chosen to not use slides. This is going to be Richie Unplugged, and it really is coming from my heart as well as my mind, or maybe I shouldn't make a distinction between them. That's probably a dualistic way of thinking. And actually, in terms of lived experience, they are not separate. Let me begin by saying that I first met Francisco in 1981 in New York when we were both working at doing some research in this laboratory of E. Roy John, a well-known neuroscientist, where we were doing an experiment measuring the duration of a perceptual moment. That was my first encounter with Francisco. And then about 11 years later, we were roommates together at Kashmir Cottage for 3 weeks when we were schlepped all this equipment thinking that we were going to begin the process of contemplative neuroscience by studying yogis who were living in semi-retreat in Dharamsala, the area around Dharamsala. And that was really a pivotal moment for me in my relationship with Francisco and feeling the impact particularly of his practice on his science. And it was really an important inspiration for me and a kind of wake-up call in a certain way that you really can't even do this kind of science without being a dedicated practitioner. And the two really go hand in hand. There is a important insight that modern neuroscience teaches us that I'd like to mention because it relates to this whole area of embodiment and inaction. This insight concerns two fundamentally different kinds of knowledge. One form of knowledge we call declarative knowledge, and the other form of knowledge we call procedural knowledge. And there are, of course, corresponding forms of learning. There's declarative learning and procedural learning. Declarative learning is conceptual. It's learning about stuff. And we can learn about all of the things that we talked about today so far through a declarative mode, and that is the mode in which we've been engaged. We can also learn in a procedural way, and procedural learning is, by definition, embodied learning. It is skill-based, it is acquired through practice, and it is instantiated in completely different brain systems than declarative learning. And in order for real change to occur, I would argue both forms of learning are necessary. Unfortunately, the academy, I think most would agree, privileges declarative learning over procedural learning. And this is really such an important insight, and one that has not penetrated, I think, how we train young scholars who are beginning their career in contemplative studies, contemplative science, contemplative neuroscience. If one is choosing this as a domain of study, it's really imperative, I believe, that we don't privilege one form of learning over the other. And unfortunately, it's just really hard to do this in the context of the modern Western university systems. So this also brings up one theme that I did want to address, which Amy, you asked about this in your question to Evan. And Evan, I just want to say, I really loved your talk so much. And I particularly loved how you talked about the influence of Buddhism and contrasted it with the modern ways, if you will, in which Buddhism is being invoked in its relationship to science, and how when you wrote The Embodied Mind, the use of Buddhism was really different, and it resonates strongly with me, and I think it was a really beautiful, articulate description of it. And I think it's also a call for how we can think about transforming modern contemplative science in ways that are closer to how you all used Buddhism in developing the framework that is presented in The Embodied Mind. And so the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is neurophenomenology. And I just want to share an anecdote that I shared in the Mind and Life Europe meeting. And I apologize to those of you who were there and are hearing this for the second time, but it's something that was deeply personal and meaningful to me. We were scheduled to have a meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin in the fall of 2001 with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. who was visiting at that time. And Francisco was scheduled to participate in that meeting. And Francisco was unable to participate because of his declining health. And in his place, he sent Antoine Lutz, who is a neuroscientist who I believe was Francisco's last graduate student. Correct me if I'm mistaken about that, but I think that's true. And so Antoine came to Madison to give a talk in place of Francisco. And in 2001, these were in the days before Zoom was invented, before we had readily available video conferencing technology. And we set up a video link between our meeting and Francisco's bed in Paris. This was the last time that His Holiness the Dalai Lama said goodbye to Francisco, and it was a deeply moving moment. It was also a kind of turning the wheel, and Antoine ended up staying in Madison for 10 years. Of course, he went home to get a few things, not many, and then came back. Antoine has been central to so much of our work on the contemplative neuroscience of meditation, and also on this specific topic of neurophenomenology. And I want to just say one thing about neurophenomenology, because it also relates to this insight regarding declarative and procedural knowledge. So we began to do studies with very long-term meditation practitioners where we were measuring brain activity and also getting reports of their experience to further the project of neurophenomenology. And we were getting reports on specific granular features of their experience and getting fairly frequent reports so that we can look at the relationship between these reports and these ongoing measures of brain activity that were being collected at the same time in real time. And we compared the long-term practitioners to age and gender matched controls who were engaged in the same neurophenomenological exploration. We were measuring their brain activity and querying their experience with the same categories of experience. And what we observed was really profound in that the relationship between the measures of experience and the brain activity were dramatically higher in the long-term meditators than they were among the untrained controls. And this was an important observation for us because it really, I think, taught us that if we're going to advance the project of neurophenomenology, it's imperative that we have participants who are experienced in reporting on the workings of their own mind. And if they're not familiar with their mind, and my understanding is that one of the translations of the word meditation itself is familiarization. It's familiarizing ourselves with the very nature of our own minds. And if we're unfamiliar, and to put it colloquially, if we're not used to inspecting our own minds, if you will, the information that we provide in response to these queries is going to be quite muddled. And what we would say is it's going to be heavily tainted by a person's theories about what might be going on what they think should be going on, but not necessarily what might actually be going on. And so the associations that we find are so much stronger between the reports of experience and ongoing brain activity in the meditators compared to the non-meditators, because they have, if you will, cleaned the lens, and they are reporting on their own mind with clarity, with what they would say is luminosity, in a way that can illuminate literally these processes in ways that are unfamiliar and in many cases opaque to the untrained mind. And so this really goes back to the declarative and procedural ideas, because it suggests that this kind of procedural knowledge, which is the skill-based kind of knowledge that is acquired through practice, is going to be really important to advance our understanding of neurophenomenology and this project of examining the relationship between the brain and experience. So I want to move on now, and I should say that there are three other things that I'm going to talk about beyond neurophenomenology. One is make some remarks about embodiment and inaction. The second is to talk about emotion, compassion, and embodiment. And finally, I will end on a kind of call to action and specifically highlight a deep problem, I think, that we all need to be honest about and to confront, which has been alluded to earlier. But I think we need to let that problem bother us in a major way in order for change to occur, the kind of change that I think we all wish or aspire to happen. Okay, so with that as a little background, let me talk a little bit about embodiment and inaction, and also this will be a natural segue into emotion, compassion, and embodiment. First, I'll start by by naming an emotion. It's interesting. I don't think that the word emotion has been said before by any of the previous speakers, and with all due respect to you guys who I love, and certainly I understand that there are very broad views of cognition that would include emotion as a subset of cognition. And I don't mean to be creating a dichotomy or a division, but the fact is that there is a large corpus of science around emotion. And in fact, this corpus of science around emotion probably preceded the science of cognition. I mean, it's arguable, but certainly I think some would argue that. And I think some would argue that cognition is actually a subset of what we might think of as emotion or affect. Certainly affect or emotion precedes ontogenetically what we typically would call cognition. I also think arguments have been made that it precedes the origins of cognition phylogenetically. And so it is quite basic and important. And the thing about emotion is that you really can't avoid embodiment when you talk about emotion, because emotion is a process that includes the body. And that is, that's been established empirically. And also it is part of the history of emotion. I want to simply remind people that William James, when he talked about emotion, talked about how emotion was literally the perception of the bodily changes that occur in response to things in our environment. And so in this definition of emotion that was presented in 1890, it was a definition of emotion that included at least some aspect of embodiment. And so I think that this is really important to acknowledge. And I want to now just say a few things about the process of embodiment and enaction and its relationship to compassion, which is a quality that I think we can think of as a prototypical embodied quality that includes aspects of emotion as well as cognition, and it is something that can be nurtured through both declarative and procedural learning, both of which we would say are really important. One of the things that we found in some of our earliest studies of compassion, which turned out to be very puzzling in the initial stages, but have taken on meaning both in the context of the contemplative traditions and also in the context of the work that we've heard, the beautiful work that we've heard on Enaction today. And that is that when long-term practitioners were generating compassion, one of the things that happens in the brain, which was surprising to us, is that there was activation in the motor cortex of the brain and in other motor regions. And this was something that we had no idea how to explain initially. And in fact, we searched for explanations that might be the result of various kinds of artifact. That was our first hypothesis as to why we were seeing activation in these motor regions of the brain. And through a variety of methods and various kinds of control conditions, we came to the conclusion, convinced ourselves, and apparently convinced enough other scientists that in fact, it wasn't an artifact, and that it was genuine activation of motor regions of the brain. And when we began to speak with the contemplatives who were generating this state of compassion, they immediately responded to this as, yes, this makes complete sense because compassion is preparation for action. It is the kind of preparation that enables an individual to spring into action the moment suffering is encountered. And so this kind of pattern of brain activity, among many other changes in the brain, took on significance when we began to think of it in that way, and began to think of it in the context of inaction and how our meaning making is indeed transacted through the dance of our relationship with our environment writ large. And so this idea of preparing the individual for the context in which suffering is encountered, I think is really important. The other thing that we studied, and there is a funny anecdote about this, which I shared too in the Mind and Life Europe meeting, and I'll just share it briefly now. When we were together with Francisco in Dharamsala in 1992, the Dalai Lama asked us to give a talk to the young monks in the Nyamgal monastery about what we were doing. And we had all this equipment with us, which we really didn't use at all. And so we thought that at least we can use it to give them a demonstration of how we can record brain activity. And so the subject in this case was actually Francisco. And we were putting electrodes on his head, and we were going to show his brain activity on this computer monitor. And this was in 1992. So think about what computers looked like in 1992, what our methods were like then. Everything was a lot bigger, heavier, more clunky, and took a lot longer. And so it took us about 45 minutes to get Francisco all set up. We finally had this going. We had his brain activity beautifully being displayed. And then we parted away from the computer monitor on we had 200 monks who were with us on cushions on the floor, and they just started laughing hysterically. They were cracking up, and they were cracking up not because Francisco looked funny with the electrode cap on, because we were talking about compassion, and we were putting electrodes on the head and not on the heart. And this was something that took us a long time to really process, and not to say that we fully understand or acknowledge this at this time by any means. There's so much more work to do, but it began to be impressed upon us to take the body more seriously in the research that we and others were doing, and to exclude the body from these studies was a serious omission. And so we began to study the heart as well as the brain and the mind. And lo and behold, we found some remarkable changes, particularly in these long-term meditation practitioners, that occur between the brain and the heart. And what we see is this increased coupling between the brain and the heart, which occurs during compassion. And this, we think, is a reflection of the kind of changes that might be brought about through the training that these individuals have undergone in nurturing this quality of compassion. And we think of compassion and we think of related qualities like kindness as qualities that are indeed innate. We are born to flourish in this way, but compassion and kindness are very much like language. We all have the capacity for these qualities, but in order for these capacities to be expressed, they need to be nurtured. Just like language. If we are not raised in a normal linguistic community, we will not develop normal language. And similarly, if we're not raised in a normal socio-emotional community that nurtures and regards with importance these qualities, they will not be nurtured either. And so this is something really important in terms of the relationship between the body and the mind and the brain. And this led us to do a certain kind of work that we're still doing today that I'd like to mention, which has to do with the coherence between our bodies and our minds during emotional states. And the measure of coherence itself, it turns out, is predictive of a person's well-being, even if a person is stressed. And so let me say it a different way, and I'll also give you a feel for the evidence, and I'm just checking to see when I need to finish. Okay, I have 5 more minutes. Is that right? Okay.
You have 15 minutes.
Oh, 15 minutes. Okay, great. Okay. This idea of coherence is something that we've been exploring in a variety of contexts over the last few years. And it turns out that the relationship between a person's reports of their emotional experience and the concordance of those reports with ongoing physiological changes is itself a mark of well-being. So the greater the coherence, the greater a person's well-being, even if they're stressed. So if a person is subjected to adversity and shows, for example, biological changes that we think might be associated with being subjected to that adversity, and their reports of their experience are different, if they're not reporting that they're stressed, to put it simply, that actually is a marker of ill-being rather than well-being. So there is something about coherence itself, independent of where you fall on this broad continuum, if we can think of it as a continuum, that is really important. And we have studied this in a variety of ways, and there's still much more work to do related to this, but this also goes back to the project of neurophenomenology and the finding that I first described of the differences in this measure of coherence between a person's report of their experience and the ongoing brain activity among people who have not trained their mind compared to people who have cleaned the lens, so to speak, through becoming more familiar with the nature of their mind through procedural practices. So I want to now end with the following. Surveys show that approximately 15% of the population in Western countries regards transforming their mind as a possibility and has engaged in one or another strategy, whatever it might be, to actually improve their well-being and promote their flourishing. 15%. There are 85% of the people who have not done that and vary in what we might call stages of readiness. I think all of us would agree that all of us, in one way or another, are suffering, with the possible exception of the few true awakened beings on this planet. And maybe even the 85%, some of whom don't fully recognize their own suffering, although people around them likely do, that they are really, if you will, in need of the kind of strategies that we're talking about even more. And when we are with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of the things His Holiness is very fond of reminding us is that there are 7 billion people on the planet. And every one of us has both the capacity and the right to flourish. And so how do we speak to the 85% that we're not speaking to? And none of those 85% are on this webinar. And this is a serious problem, and one that I think we need to let bother us. Because if we're not speaking to those 85%, then we're going to continue on a trajectory that I think most of us would agree is not a very healthy or sustainable one. And I'm not suggesting that we have the answers at all, but I am suggesting that we take this problem seriously and that we have a moral obligation, given who we are and the kinds of approaches that we represent. We have a moral obligation to do everything we can to reach these 85%. And so I will end there and leave a little bit more time for discussion. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Richie, and appreciate that exhortation for thinking about that 85%. So I want to just say a couple of things. I'm not going to attempt to do a summarization of any kind, or really even try to point out some of the places of integration between Evan's presentation and Richie's, because Richie has explicitly done some of that nicely in his talk. But I do want to predict some of the connections that you're going to hear about tomorrow, and therefore encourage you to come on back and listen to those presentations and think about some of those connections. One of them is going to have to do with what Evan was talking about in regard to the implications of the Enaction perspective for how it is that we do and think about science. And that's something that very explicitly Adam Frank is going to be discussing in his talk on doing physics and being a subject. So I think we'll see some interesting synergies there. Secondly, when Evan was referencing Kyle White's notion of an epistemology of coordination, I was thinking about some of what Abiba Berhane is going to be talking with us about on machine learning and complexity, particularly in regard to how it is that we factor into these ways of doing science, some of which seem to have a natural alignment with Enaction, particularly in regard to complex systems dynamics, and yet historically have neglected a kind of ethical consideration of marginalized people to whom these kinds of, especially technologic developments, have been directed. So that's something else I want to foreshadow. And then finally, of course, relevant to both what Richie has been talking about and also Evan's comments about the history of the Enaction perspective, John Dunn is going to be closing with his talk on Enaction from a Buddhist perspective, making very explicit some of the historical connections with Buddhist philosophy. So those are the things I wanted to just draw your attention to. We do have a few minutes where there may be some things. Let me start with the other faculty that you might want to raise, point out, question in regard to both of the afternoon speakers. And you can do so simply by unmuting yourself.
And our faculty as well.
Right, that's what I had said, yes.
So there's a question from Nicole Silvas, who's asking if it's possible. Maybe I should get this properly translated, but es posible llevarla en acción al servicio de la política. So can we actualize inaction in service to politics? I'd be very interested to hear Ezekiel and Hannah's perspective on this.
I think that's a very important question, but I think we have to be careful because in the enactive approach is well, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of doing philosophy and science, and maybe a bit more than that, but it's not the whole of human activity. And politics involves gathering together with many actors who perhaps wouldn't care so much about an active approach. And you have to deal with them too. And they might be antagonistic to it as well. So politics is about actually getting into some form of participation that cannot be prescribed by a particular perspective, but it has to be open to the possibilities of changing your perspective, which I have to say,
Ezekiel, I mean, I think that is in a certain way, not only a view, but an approach.
It is, yes, that's right.
Which has political implications.
That's right, yes. You're right. I mean, in a way, if you come with that way of looking at it into dealing with political problems, in a way you are doing, if you like, an enactive approach, if you have that sort of awareness. But it's not as if there's going to be a recipe or a simple way in which, well, we can get the remaining 85% of the population to pay attention. Many of those 85% are probably suffering not just because of the lack of information about ways of improving their minds, but they're suffering from hunger, war, unemployment, and homelessness, which I doubt will entirely go away by promoting genuine ways of improving their well-being, not saying they're not genuine. So we have a bigger problem than just simply reaching people with a message. That's something I think is a bit different in the way I conceive of the possibilities of bringing this knowledge of these practices into a political arena. We have to be aware of all that other things, all those other things are happening too.
So I'm curious, Evan, what your response is to Ezekiel's perspective.
I think I share it. I think politics is a different domain where, of course, those of us who are already instilled in an enactive perspective are going to approach politics and political questions in a certain way, but we can't assume that that's going to be generally held by those who occupy that space. And I don't think one should go in trying to make that the political message. One of the things that I thought of just now, some of you knew Hazel Henderson, who was a long time alternative economist and advocate for social change. And I knew her for many years. She was a very close friend of my father's, and came to Lindisfarne many times. She was really a kind of towering presence. Literally, she was very tall, and she was remarkable. And this was something Ralph Nader said in the interview about Hazel Henderson that just happened a couple of days ago on NPR. He said she would walk into a room and she would speak to people in a way that didn't divide them into left, right, liberal, conservative. She would speak to them about what everybody cares about in being, a person. And she had a remarkable ability to do that and to lead them from that into talking about climate change and talking about, alternative energies to fossil fuels. And that's a skill in the sense that Richie, was talking about. You're not going to learn that just by reading about politics or studying political science or political theory. I mean, you need to you need to embody that as your way of being, as your craft, and learn it through experience. And she really did it in a remarkable way. So I think, I'm not that kind of a person.
No.
And, I admire people like that, and certainly we need more of them. But that's, I think, what we really need to deal with the predicament. We need people who embody that kind of know-how.
Thank you, Evan. Richie, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make one small comment, and that is, while I obviously completely agree with your comments, Ezekiel, about the critical importance of systemic change and the impact of systemic injustice in influencing our well-being, data clearly shows two important things. One is that poverty, for many different complex reasons, is highly comorbid with mental health challenges. And the second related piece is that there are data that also show that if you directly pit strategies that are purely systemic economic strategies, including direct cash transfer in addressing extreme poverty, with approaches that focus on the mental health of the participants, and you look downstream at the economic impact is far greater when you address the mental health needs than when you do a direct cash transfer or strictly an economic solution. The data are very clear.
Thanks, Richie. Hannah, do you have something you'd like, since your focus has been on social and environmental justice, or at least social justice? What is your perspective on this?
Yeah, I would like to lift out the points made by Ezekiel and Evan, that in order to speak to people who we aren't including, so to speak, we have to really, really understand what matters to them by really listening to what matters to them. I don't think it might be dangerous to try to impose a way of thinking without doing a proper listening. And we are trying to do a proper listening, but we have to be really careful that we actually do that. So starting from what matters to a person who really thinks very differently, and listening to them properly so that you understand why they are voting a certain way that we don't like. It's still important to hear why they are doing that. That's where things have to start, I think.
Thanks. Evan, could you reflect one more, just a little bit, on Kyle White's perspective?
I don't know if I can say much more. I mean, he has a whole body of work, and I've read some of his things and not all of them. I mean, what stands out for me is this idea he has that a number of ideas. So one, he makes the point that when we talk about climate change and when we frame it in terms of catastrophe, that we often fall into narratives that are ones that are foreign to indigenous peoples and that perpetuate injustices, because we use, for example, a linear sense of time culminating in an apocalypse, whereas indigenous peoples have been living in a world that's, from the perspective of their ancestors, dystopian already for hundreds of years. So when we bring a particular conceptual frame, particularly with an instrumental way of thinking about crisis, to the discussions, we've already skewed the conversation that needs to happen. And so, his way of reframing that is through what I talked about in terms of epistemologies of coordination. So I think having voices like that, I mean, he would be a wonderful person to have at this meeting if he would ever be interested and agree to it.
Yes.
I think having voices like that are really important, that give a different sense of time and of history and of community. Because even with our best intentions, we come from where we come from with the concepts and sensibilities we have, and we default to them. And so we need other participants who are going to present things in a different way. So he would be an example of that.
And, in this regard, do you feel that the enactive perspective is exclusive of, for example, a view that Kyle White might hold in relation to relationality or bonding?
No, not exclusive at all. I mean, one of the things I think is particularly interesting about his contrasting crisis thinking with kinship thinking is that it echoes, ideas. For example, I think I talked about this last year, Gregory Bateson talked about the effects of conscious purpose on human adaptation, where conscious purpose is where you go in and you want to affect something from a sort of limited reflective stance, and you're dealing with a complex system in which you pull out one sort of pathway that you perceive in a linear way that severs it from the larger complex network. And that's what he called conscious purpose. And he said, that's what we've been doing in an amplified way through industrialization. And I think that's exactly what Kyle White is talking about when he talks about crisis epistemology. And so, what Bateson said is, he said, we need wisdom and we need love. And that starts with an acknowledgement of otherness and of complexity. And that's what I hear Kyle White saying in his own language. So I see them as very much compatible. I mean, Bateson, the grandfather of the enactive view. I mean, he didn't use the word inaction, but Francisco was very, very shaped by Gregory's thinking. And so he's kind of a grandfather figure for the enactive view. And I see that as very, very, deeply in sync with the kinds of things that Kyle White is talking about.
Thanks. And I think it's very congruent with what Richie is pointing to. Mm-hmm. I think we have to be time sensitive.
Yes.
But I want to thank all of our presenters and all of you today for being part of this exploration of what we began this day with, which was, what does inaction mean, particularly in the context of our lived experience at this time. So Ezekiel, thank you so much. And Hannah, Amy, for your reflection. And Richie, thank you. That was such a rich perspective, and getting the history, but also the perspective view. Thank you.
Thanks, Rishi. And just draw your attention for the participants, there had been a request for some references to work that Richie had mentioned, and he kindly posted that in the chat. If you click on those three little dots that sit on the side of that posting, you can copy that for yourself. Also, we'll be putting this together, both the Q&A and the chat comments and questions, and reviewing those so that we can address as much as possible in our final discussion tomorrow afternoon. Thanks so much, everybody.